You're standing outside Topkapi Palace in 1623, watching the royal gardeners carry a heavy sack toward the Bosphorus. Inside is a woman who spoke too openly about palace matters. She's about to vanish under the dark water. In this place, speaking too much could only be punished with death. This is the Ottoman Sultan's harem, a world where beauty was both a gift and a danger. Luxury came with a cost written in blood. A wrong look or a whispered word could decide your fate, worse than any medieval torture. For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled 3 continents. But behind the golden walls of the palace was a punishment system so harsh it made today's toughest prisons seem like hotels. What you're about to hear is taken from palace records, stories of those who lived there, and evidence found by historians. It shows how the empire kept hundreds of women under control with methods that shock even now. The most feared person in the harem wasn't the sultan. It was a man who could never touch a woman but decided who lived or died. The chief black eunuch, called the Kisler Aga, stood at the top of a system built on fear. His arrival could make faces turn pale and silence every whisper. This was no symbolic role. The Kisler Aga held more real power than many ministers of the empire. He ruled over every part of life in the harem. He decided who ate and who went hungry, who received care when sick, and who was sewn into sacks to be thrown into the Bosphorus. Men chosen for this job weren't picked for wisdom or leadership. They were picked for their ability to frighten and to punish without hesitation. They needed to be clever enough to handle palace politics but cruel enough to carry out executions themselves. Every day, the Kisler Aga walked through the harem, checked every corner, listened to reports from spies, and judged who should be punished. He kept records on every woman. Her talks, her friendships, her behavior, even the smallest sign of trouble. These records were not just notes. They were death sentences waiting for the order to act. What made it worse was how it destroyed normal bonds between people. Women were pushed to report on each other, turning friends into threats. The Kisler Aga built spy networks inside the harem, giving out small rewards in exchange for secrets. Mothers reported on daughters. Sisters exposed sisters. Best friends turned against each other for the promise of favor. The empire's system made women part of their own oppression, making resistance nearly impossible when no one could be trusted. Punishments were also used as a show of fear. The Kisler Aga often announced them in public, forcing others to watch. These were not quick deaths meant to spare pain. They were staged carefully to spread terror, making sure every woman understood the cost of disobedience. The most dangerous part of his power was the way he used uncertainty. Women never knew which rules mattered on a given day, or which mistake would be ignored versus punished with death. Living in this constant fear kept everyone off balance, unable to plan or join together. The Kisler Aga's rooms were placed in the harem so he could watch many areas at once. Inside, he kept maps of the entire complex, daily schedules of every woman, and most frightening, objects taken from those who had been executed. These trophies reminded everyone of his reach and the price of disobedience. Under his command, punishments ranged from small humiliations to tortures that left lasting scars. But the mental punishments were often worse. Women could be locked away for months, cut off from everyone except guards who brought a little food and water. Their names were taken away and replaced with numbers, until they forgot who they had been before the palace. Some were forced to watch others being punished, creating a shared fear that crushed any thought of fighting back. Others were offered hope, promises of freedom or advancement, only to have those hopes pulled away at the last second. The Kisler Aga knew that breaking someone's spirit worked better than breaking their body, though he was ready to do both. What made the system even more disturbing was how it fit into the larger Ottoman world. Laws supported it, calling it necessary for order. Religious leaders defended it. Scholars wrote papers justifying it. Foreign guests were carefully kept away from seeing the truth behind the palace walls. His authority went far beyond the harem. He managed money, controlled slave trade routes, and even influenced imperial policy because of his access to the Sultan. His advice could decide the fate of provinces, battles, and even the empire's expansion. This shows something important about Ottoman rule. Cruelty wasn't just allowed. It was organized, managed, and made part of daily administration, like collecting taxes or training soldiers. The punishments that followed weren't the actions of one cruel man, but official policies meant to control through fear. Records show that each Kisler Aga had his own methods. Some preferred mental tricks, others relied on physical pain, and the strongest mixed both, using knowledge of human behavior in ways that modern interrogators would admire. Their training was unlike any other empires. New chiefs were taught how to read small facial changes, catch lies, and spot trouble before it happened. They studied how girls of different backgrounds reacted, knowing a Greek villager might respond differently than a Circassian princess, and used that knowledge to tighten control. These men kept close notes on every woman under their watch. They knew who was naturally obedient, who held rebellious thoughts, and who could be pushed into spying with a mix of rewards and threats. The most skilled Kisler Agas could almost predict who might try to escape, who would attempt to charm guards, and who would eventually collapse under the pressure of palace life. The worst part of the punishment system wasn't only its cruelty, it was its inventiveness. The Ottoman court turned suffering into a calculated tool, creating punishments that made victims long for a quick death. These were not random acts of anger. They were planned, precise responses meant to warn the rest of the harem. The first level of punishment was called attitude adjustment in palace records. Women who didn't show enough cheerfulness in their duties, who failed to smile during visits, or who looked sad were punished right away. One method forced them to stand for days without sitting or leaning. At first it seems mild, but the effect was crushing. They were placed in open courtyards where everyone could see them, living examples of what happened if you didn't perform happiness. Legs swelled, backs twisted with pain, and minds broke down under the mix of exhaustion and shame. Those who fell were dragged into underground isolation cells. These rooms were small, completely dark, and silent, built so women couldn't stretch their bodies. They were kept there for weeks, fed just enough to survive while their minds unraveled. The aim wasn't just to punish, it was to reshape. When they came out, many showed signs of what palace doctors called palace madness. They smiled on command, obeyed every order, and lost all sense of self. The second level of punishment was for women who broke bigger rules, like trying to reach the outside world or forming relationships inside the harem. These punishments were called educational experiences. The most feared was being forced to watch someone you cared about suffer. If you had a close friend, she would be tortured while you were made to watch. If you cared for a servant or guard, they would be mutilated in front of you. The message was clear: showing love meant destroying the one you loved. Emotional detachment became the only way to survive. Some tried to fake indifference, but the Kisler Aga and his men were skilled at spotting the truth. They tested bonds by staging fake emergencies to see who would rush to help, or by spreading false news of executions to watch who passed warnings. The third level of punishment was for women who tried to escape or were suspected of plotting against the Sultan. This was called permanent correction. The goal was to keep the women alive but remove their ability to resist. Mutilation was common but carefully chosen. Tendons cut so they couldn't run, tongues partly removed so they couldn't speak clearly, or fingers broken so they couldn't write. The goal was never just to cripple a woman but to turn her into a daily warning. Others in the harem would see the injuries and be reminded of the cost of defiance. Yet the Ottomans also knew physical wounds had limits, bodies could heal, and sometimes martyrs inspired rebellion. The punishments that cut deepest were aimed at the spirit. These left the body alive but the person inside broken beyond repair. The harem drew on long Ottoman experience with prisoners of war and political enemies, perfecting methods to erase human identity while leaving the shell intact. One especially cruel tactic was the destruction of memory. Women were given drugs that interfered with forming new memories, while being grilled endlessly about their past. Over time, they forgot who they were before palace life, until their only identity came from their captors. The worst part of this was how it killed hope. If you couldn't recall your parents' names, your village, or your life before, how could you imagine going back? The empire had found a way to cage not just bodies but entire souls, leaving women stuck in a present with no escape. The fourth level of punishment was for the gravest offense, believing you had a real bond with the Sultan. Women who thought beauty or wit had given them special status were forced to learn the truth through what records call reality education. They were made to watch, restrained, while the Sultan was intimate with other women, seeing every detail and unable to look away. The emotional destruction of realizing their love meant nothing was often worse than torture. It didn't end there. Officials read out administrative files that described them in the same cold terms used for furniture or animals. They learned their private moments had been recorded, graded, and critiqued by eunuchs who suggested improvements. Some women shattered instantly. Others clung to denial until they were shown the actual reports, listing their physical reactions, their whispered words, even the Sultan's notes on their usefulness. The moment they understood that nothing was genuine, that every embrace and word had been calculated, left wounds that never healed. The fifth and final stage was called final education. This was the end point for women who resisted every other attempt to break them. These weren't ordinary executions but rituals designed to display the empire's complete control over life and death. The most infamous was the sewing ritual, long linked with harem punishment. But records show it wasn't just throwing a body in a sack. It was a staged event that could last hours. The condemned woman was brought before an assembly of harem residents, all forced to watch each step unfold. She would be stripped of anything that tied her to her identity: jewelry, clothing, even the henna marks on her hands that showed her background. The aim was to reduce her to nothing but a body before disposal. The sewing was done while she was still conscious, using thick needles and rough rope that caused sharp pain but kept the sack tightly sealed. The palace seamstresses who carried out this work were trained to move slowly, giving others plenty of time to watch and understand each stitch. The drowning didn't happen right away. The sack, with the victim alive inside, was carried through different parts of the harem so that others could hear her muffled cries and know this was a real person, not just a warning. The fear this created in witnesses was just as important as the suffering of the victim. Finally, the sack would be lowered into the Bosphorus at chosen spots along the palace walls. The location depended on the crime and the message officials wanted to send. Some spots were in full view of harem windows, forcing women to watch the splash as their companion vanished under the waves. Records of these punishments still exist, stored in archives across Istanbul, waiting for historians willing to study them. The Ottoman harem stands as one of history's clearest examples of how absolute power destroys, turning supposed paradise into torment through fear and control. The same empire that built great mosques and ruled continents also perfected the breaking of human souls behind its golden walls. Even today, when walking through the beautiful courtyards of Topkapi Palace, we should remember the women whose cries once filled these halls, a reminder that what we call civilization is more fragile than we want to admit.